March 1942. A merchant seaman clings to wreckage in the North Atlantic, watching his ship, laden with wheat from Canada, slip beneath black water. He's one of the lucky ones. Most of his crewmates went down with the vessel, victims of a torpedo they never saw coming. Somewhere beneath the waves, a German U-boat commander is already plotting an intercept course for his next target. This scene repeated itself with horrifying regularity throughout 1942, the year that nearly brought Britain to its knees. The numbers tell a story of catastrophe. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats sent over 3 million tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. That's roughly 585 merchant vessels, more than 3 ships every single day. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat fleet was operating with near impunity, especially during what the Germans gleefully called the Second Happy Time. American waters, freshly entered into the war and woefully unprepared, became a shooting gallery. Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, saw U-boats torpedoing tankers within sight of civilians strolling along Florida beaches. But the true battleground remained the North Atlantic convoy routes. Britain, an island nation, imported nearly 60 million tons of material annually before the war. Everything from petroleum to powdered eggs, from steel to sugar, had to cross 3,000 miles of increasingly hostile ocean. By mid-1942, imports had collapsed to barely 23 million tons. The mathematics were brutally simple. Britain consumed more than it produced. Every sunken freighter didn't just represent lost cargo, it represented lost time, lost calories, lost fuel, lost hope. Winston Churchill, normally bullish even in Britain's darkest moments, later confessed that only one thing truly frightened him during the entire war: the U-boat peril. He had good reason. The Kriegsmarine had refined submarine warfare into a science. Type 7 U-boats, the workhorses of Dönitz's fleet, operated in coordinated wolf packs. Rudeltaktik in German. These weren't solitary hunters, but organized packs of 8, 10, sometimes 15 submarines working in concert. They'd spread across known convoy routes, and when one boat spotted prey, it would radio the others. Then they'd converge, attacking in waves, usually at night, when surfaced U-boats could outrun the lumbering merchant vessels. The escort situation was dire. Royal Navy destroyers and corvettes, stretched impossibly thin across global commitments, struggled to protect convoys that might stretch 10 miles across the ocean. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly stretch beyond the range of land-based aircraft, became known as the Black Pit. Here, 600 miles from any airfield, U-boats attacked with near certainty of success. Escort commanders found themselves playing a lethal game they couldn't win. Convoy On 92 in May 1942 lost 7 ships out of 41. SC-107 in November lost 15 out of 42. The standard defensive doctrine wasn't working. Convoys sailed in columns, escorts patrolled predictable patterns around them, and U-boats simply waited for the geometry to align. Depth charges, the primary anti-submarine weapon, required a vessel to pass almost directly over a submerged U-boat, a needle-in-haystack proposition in the vast Atlantic. ASDIC, the British forerunner to sonar, had limitations. It couldn't detect surfaced submarines, lost contact at close ranges, and became unreliable in rough seas. Morale on merchant ships crumbled. Crews signed on, knowing they faced roughly a 1 in 4 chance of being torpedoed. Many vessels made multiple crossings, watching sister ships vanish in columns of water and flame. The psychological toll was immense. Britain needed a solution, and it needed one fast. The island nation was, quite literally, starving for an answer. Into this crisis stepped a man the Admiralty had repeatedly overlooked: Commander Frederick John Walker wasn't the Royal Navy's idea of a model officer. At 43 years old in 1941, he'd spent much of his career in staff positions rather than at sea, a career pattern that typically marked an officer as competent but uninspiring. He'd been passed over for promotion multiple times. His personnel file noted a tendency toward unorthodox tactical thinking that made senior officers uncomfortable. But Walker possessed something the Royal Navy desperately needed: an obsessive, calculating mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. Walker had joined the Royal Navy in 1909, aged 11, as a cadet at Osborne Naval College. His early career showed promise. He'd served aboard HMS Ajax during the First World War and later specialized in anti-submarine warfare during the 1920s, a period when most ambitious officers dismissed submarine hunting as a backwater posting. Whilst others climbed the promotion ladder through battleship commands and diplomatic postings, Walker buried himself in the geometry of underwater warfare. He filled notebooks with calculations about torpedo spreads, submarine diving times, and depth-charge trajectories. His brother officers thought him peculiar. They'd proved to be spectacularly wrong. By 1941, Walker's unorthodox reputation had landed him command of HMS Stork, a Bittern-class sloop. Hardly a prestigious assignment. Sloops were smaller, slower escort vessels, unglamorous workhorses of convoy protection. But Walker treated his command like a floating laboratory. He drilled his crew relentlessly, timing and retiming every evolution. How quickly could they prepare depth charges? How fast could they respond to an ASDIC contact? He timed responses to the second, then demanded they shave off more seconds. His officers initially thought him mad. One rating later recalled, "The captain had us dropping practice charges until we could do it in our sleep. He'd wake us at all hours, call action stations, time us with his stopwatch. We thought he was cracked." But there was method in Walker's apparent madness. He'd identified something other escort commanders missed. Anti-submarine warfare was fundamentally a mathematics problem disguised as naval combat. Every engagement came down to geometry, speed, probability. A U-boat diving to evade had limited oxygen, roughly 12 hours submerged at slow speed. Its battery life constrained its underwater speed and maneuverability. Its periscope gave limited visibility. Its torpedoes traveled at known speeds on predictable trajectories. These weren't mystical sea monsters, they were machines governed by physics. Walker's approach bordered on obsessive. He slept 4 hours a night, spending his watchkeeping hours running calculations, gaming out scenarios. What if a convoy altered course every 7 minutes instead of maintaining heading? What if escorts steamed not around the convoy but through its columns? What if depth charge patterns were randomized? His cabin became cluttered with charts covered in geometric diagrams, vectors, angles, probability cones. The Admiralty's tactical doctrine for convoy defense had barely evolved since 1917. Screen the merchants, patrol set patterns, react to attacks. Walker found this reactive approach fundamentally flawed. U-boats held the initiative. They chose when and where to attack. They exploited predictability. Walker's innovation was conceptual. What if escorts didn't protect convoys? What if they hunted submarines? What if the hunters became the hunted? In December 1941, Walker received command of the 36th Escort Group, multiple vessels under his tactical control. Finally, he had the canvas to paint his theories into practice. His first innovation seemed simple, but proved revolutionary. Aggressive prosecution of every possible contact. Where other commanders would drop a few depth charges, then return to the convoy, Walker's groups would hunt a submarine relentlessly, sometimes for 18 hours, until they killed it or exhausted its batteries. forcing it to surface. Walker's aggressive hunting tactics brought successes, but he'd identified a deeper problem that kept him awake at night. The kills he achieved came after torpedoes had already struck. He was treating symptoms, not the disease. The real issue haunted him. Why were U-boats hitting targets with such devastating accuracy? The answer lay in mathematics that heavily favored the attacker. Convoy doctrine required merchant vessels to sail in straight lines at constant speed. This wasn't arbitrary. It was practical necessity. 40 or 50 cargo ships, many manned by civilian crews with varying levels of seamanship, needed to maintain formation across hundreds of miles of ocean. Station keeping in a convoy demanded predictability. Ships steamed in columns roughly 600 yards apart, maintaining precise positions relative to the flagship. Any deviation risked collision, especially at night, when radio silence was mandatory and visual signals limited. The Admiralty's convoy instructions were explicit. Maintain course and speed. Execute turns in unison only when ordered. But this predictability transformed every merchant ship into a mathematical certainty for German torpedo calculators. The U-boat's primary targeting instrument, the Vorhaltrechner, deflection calculator, was a mechanical computer of surprising sophistication. A U-boat commander needed to input only 3 variables: target speed, target bearing, and torpedo speed. The calculator then produced the required aim-off angle, where to shoot. Not at the target's current position, but where it would be when the torpedo arrived. For a target maintaining steady course and speed, this calculation approached certainty. Consider the geometry. A G7E electric torpedo travelled at 30 knots. A typical convoy steamed at 8 knots. If a U-boat fired from 1,000 yards, a standard attack range, the torpedo required roughly 60 seconds to reach its target. In those 60 seconds, a merchant ship travelling at 8 knots covered approximately 270 yards. The Vorhaltrechner calculated this deflection angle instantaneously. Against a target holding steady course, a competent U-boat commander could achieve hit rates exceeding 60%. Walker pored over attack reports and found exactly that. When U-boats achieved good firing positions, they rarely missed. The problem compounded with torpedo spreads. U-boats typically fired in salvos, 3 or 4 torpedoes with slight angular separation between them. This created a fan of torpedoes covering an area of ocean. Even if one torpedo missed ahead, another might catch the target amidships, and a third might strike aft. The mathematics became a probability cone, and straight-line targets sat squarely within that cone. Walker ran the numbers obsessively. He calculated that a U-boat positioned 90 degrees off a convoy's beam, directly to the side, had a 58-second window from submerging periscope depth to firing solution. The merchant ship's constant bearing and speed meant the Vorhaltrechner's solution remained valid for that entire window. The U-boat commander could take his time, refine his data, and fire with confidence. It was, Walker realized, like shooting at a target on rails. German tactical manuals confirmed this advantage. Captured documents showed U-boat commanders were trained to seek track angles between 70 and 110 degrees, nearly perpendicular approaches where target motion was most predictable. They avoided stern chases or head-on approaches where even small speed estimation errors threw off calculations. The doctrine exploited geometry ruthlessly. Walker proposed radical alternatives at escort commanders' conferences. What if convoys zigzagged? Constant course changes that invalidated torpedo calculations. He was met with institutional resistance, bordering on hostility. Senior officers pointed to practical impossibilities. Merchant ships couldn't execute complex maneuvers. Collisions would result. Station keeping would collapse, convoys would scatter. One admiral dismissed Walker's suggestions as theoretically interesting but operationally impossible. But Walker persisted, studying every variable. A merchant ship turning even 20 degrees altered the deflection calculation significantly. If that turn occurred randomly during the U-boat's 58-second firing window, the torpedo calculator's solution became obsolete. The torpedo would pass harmlessly ahead or astern. The U-boat would need to recalculate, resurface its periscope for new bearings, risk detection. The breakthrough came during a particularly brutal crossing in February 1943. Walker's escort group was shepherding convoy HX-224 when 3 ships were torpedoed within 30 minutes. Walker stood on Storks Bridge, watching oil fires illuminate the night sky, and something crystallized in his mind. He'd been approaching the problem backwards. Zigzagging didn't need to be random. It needed to be systematic but unpredictable to the enemy. That subtle distinction changed everything. Walker retreated to his cabin and didn't emerge for 16 hours. His second-in-command later described finding him surrounded by charts, compass, protractor, and countless sheets covered in geometric diagrams. Walker had essentially reverse-engineered the U-boat's firing solution. If he knew the constraints of the Vorhaltrechner, he could design a maneuver pattern that systematically invalidated its calculations. The pattern needed specific characteristics. Course changes frequent enough to disrupt torpedo solutions, but not so extreme that merchant ships lost formation. Alterations timed to statistical probability rather than rigid schedules, and crucially, a design that appeared random to external observation but followed an internal logic convoy commodores could execute. What emerged was Pattern Buttercup, Walker's whimsical code name for a lethal defensive geometry. The pattern prescribed course alterations of 25 to 40 degrees at intervals varying between 4 and 12 minutes. The specific timing and degree of turn followed a predetermined sequence that Walker encoded onto a simple card. A convoy commodore would start the pattern upon leaving port, following the card's instructions precisely. To a U-boat commander observing through his periscope, the convoy appeared to meander drunkenly across the ocean, course and timing unpredictable. But within the convoy, every ship executed identical turns simultaneously, maintaining formation. The genius lay in Walker's probability calculations. German doctrine called for U-boats to observe a convoy for at least 15 minutes before attacking, gathering data for the Vorhaltrechner. Buttercup ensured that during any 15-minute observation window, a convoy would execute at least 2 course changes of unknown magnitude. This corrupted the targeting data. The U-boat commander might input speed and bearing, but by the time his torpedoes reached their calculated intercept point, the entire convoy had turned onto a different heading. The torpedoes would pass through empty ocean. Walker's calculations showed something even more elegant. The pattern's course changes, when averaged over an hour, maintained the convoy's base course toward its destination. Ships didn't meander aimlessly. They zigzagged around a mean course line. Navigation remained practical. A convoy bound from Halifax to Liverpool still arrived at Liverpool, having merely taken a slightly longer, serpentine route. Walker estimated Buttercup added approximately 8% to voyage time, a trivial cost if it reduced torpedo hits. The Admiralty's response was swift and discouraging. A staff memo from March 1943 called Buttercup unnecessarily complex and likely to cause confusion and collision. Walker's immediate superior recommended against implementation. The reasons cited were predictable. Merchant captains lacked training for such maneuvers. Nighttime turns risked ships losing visual contact. Radio silence couldn't be maintained if confusion arose, and fundamentally, It contradicted decades of convoy doctrine. Walker faced a bureaucratic wall, but found an unexpected ally in Admiral Sir Max Horton, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches Command. Horton, himself known for unorthodox thinking during his submarine command in the First World War, reviewed Walker's mathematics and saw merit. In April 1943, Horton authorized limited trials. Walker could implement Buttercup with convoys under his direct escort, provided merchant captains volunteered and accepted the risks. It was a grudging approval, hedged with caveats, but Walker seized it. He spent the next fortnight briefing convoy commodores, typically retired Royal Navy admirals recalled to service for convoy leadership. Walker's pitch was mathematical rather than rhetorical. He showed them the geometry, the probability calculations, the torpedo physics. Some commodores dismissed him as a crank. Others, particularly those who'd watched too many ships sink, were willing to try anything. The mathematics underpinning Buttercup revealed why it worked so devastatingly well against German torpedo doctrine. Walker had essentially weaponized geometry and probability theory, turning the U-boat's greatest advantage, the Vorhaltreckner's precision, into a fatal liability. To understand the pattern's effectiveness, one must first understand what a U-boat commander experienced during an attack. A submerged U-boat approached its target at periscope depth, roughly 15 meters below the surface. The commander's view through the periscope was limited, perhaps 6 kilometers in good visibility, far less in Atlantic weather. He needed 3 critical measurements: target bearing, which direction, target speed, how fast, and target angle, which way it was pointed relative to the U-boat. German training manuals specified taking at least 3 periscope observations over 12 to 15 minutes to establish accurate data. Each periscope exposure risked detection, so commanders minimized observation time. Here's where Buttercup's timing became lethal. Walker designed the pattern so course changes occurred, on average, every 7 minutes, precisely half the minimum observation period German doctrine required. Consider the geometry. A U-boat commander raises his periscope at minute 0, takes a bearing, notes the convoy is steering 045 degrees at 8 knots. He ducks down to avoid detection. At minute 6, he rises again for a second observation. But Buttercup has executed a 30-degree turn at minute 4. The convoy is now steering 075 degrees. The commander, unaware a turn occurred, assumes the bearing change resulted from his own U-boat's maneuvering. He inputs corrupted data into the Vorhaltreckner. The torpedo physics magnified this error. G70 electric torpedoes ran at constant depth, typically set to 4 meters, to strike beneath a ship's waterline. They traveled straight, unable to adjust course mid-flight. Once fired, a torpedo was committed to intercepting a specific point in the ocean calculated at launch. If the target changed course, even 15 degrees after launch, a torpedo aimed at midships would miss entirely. Walker's pattern ensured convoys changed course approximately every 7 minutes. A torpedo's run time from 1,000 yards was roughly 60 seconds. The mathematics were cruel to the attacker. A U-boat had to fire, have its torpedoes reach the target and see them detonate all within a 7-minute window before the next course change rendered everything moot. Walker incorporated probability theory into Buttercup's design. The pattern wasn't truly random, that would be navigationally impossible, but it was pseudo-random from an external observer's perspective. The course change intervals varied between 4 and 12 minutes, following a predetermined but complex sequence. The degree of turn varied between 25 and 40 degrees, again following a sequence. To a U-boat commander, this appeared chaotic. He couldn't identify the pattern from limited periscope observations. He couldn't predict when the next turn would occur or its magnitude. The deflection angles told the story mathematically. For a beam attack, 90 degrees to target course, at 1,000 yards, the Vorhout-Rechner calculated a deflection angle of roughly 15 degrees. This meant aiming 15 degrees ahead of the target's current position, but if the target turned 30 degrees during the torpedo's 60-second flight, the deflection error became 45 degrees. At 1,000 yards, that's a missed distance of approximately 800 yards, far beyond a torpedo's kill radius. The target would be entirely unaware it had even been attacked. Walker's notebooks contained page after page of these calculations, worked out for various scenarios, different attack angles, different ranges, different torpedo speeds. He'd essentially mapped the entire probability space of U-boat attacks and designed Buttercup to sit in the zones of maximum defensive advantage. One calculation showed that against a zigzagging target executing Buttercup, a U-boat's effective hit probability dropped from roughly 60% to under 25%, and that assumed the U-boat even achieved a firing position before the convoy's escort detected it. The first operational test came with Convoy ONS-5 in late April 1943, though Walker wouldn't escort that particular convoy himself. Instead, his proving ground arrived on 3rd May 1943 when he took command of the escort group for Convoy Ajax 237, westbound from Liverpool. Walker assembled the merchant captains before departure and presented Buttercup not as an order, but as an experiment. 27 ships volunteered, 14 captains declined, preferring traditional straight-line steaming. Walker accepted this division, curious to see if results would speak louder than directives. The Atlantic crossing began unremarkably. Walker initiated Buttercup at dusk on the second day out, signalling the pattern's start with a lamp flash to the convoy commodore aboard the merchant ship Fort Cumberland. The first course change, 32 degrees to starboard, came at the 7-minute mark. Walker watched through binoculars as the Buttercup participants executed the turn with reasonable precision. 2 ships swung wide, 1 turned sluggishly, but the formation held. The 14 non-participants maintained base course, creating 2 distinct groups within the larger convoy. German naval intelligence had identified HX-237's departure through their B-Dienst code-breaking service, and U-boat Group Elbe, 9 submarines, formed a patrol line across its projected route. On 6th of May, U-258 made contact roughly 800 miles west of Ireland, deep in the mid-Atlantic gap, where air cover couldn't reach. Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm von Messenhausen shadowed the convoy through the afternoon, radioing position reports whilst staying beyond escort range. By nightfall, 5 U-boats had converged for a coordinated attack. What happened next confounded the German commanders. U-258 approached from the convoy's port quarter, achieving what should have been an ideal firing position. Von Messenhausen later reported in his war diary, captured after the U-boat's eventual sinking in 1944, that the convoy's behavior was erratic and unpredictable. He observed for 18 minutes, attempting to establish firing data, but the target ships kept altering course. He fired a 4-torpedo spread at what his Vorhout-Rechner calculated as a certain hit. All 4 torpedoes missed. The war diary entry noted, "Convoy executing irregular maneuvers of unknown purpose. Deflection calculations unreliable. U-404 attacking from starboard experienced similar frustration. Captain Lieutenant Otto von Bülow fired 3 torpedoes at a large freighter he'd identified as approximately 8,000 tons. 1 torpedo struck, but it hit a ship in the non-Buttercup group, the American Liberty ship Samuel Huntington, which had maintained straight course. The vessel carrying iron ore sank in 4 minutes. Von Bülow attempted to press the attack, but Walker's escorts, having pinpointed his position from the torpedo tracks, forced him deep with an aggressive depth charge pattern. Through the night of 6th to 7th May, the Wolfpack made repeated attempts. U-954 managed a stern shot at a straggler, but missed when the target executed a buttercup turn just as the torpedoes reached firing range. U-638 reported impossible to establish reliable targeting data, convoy course changes every few minutes. In total, the U-boats fired 23 torpedoes at HX-237. Only 3 found targets, all 3 hitting ships in the non-Buttercup group, steaming predictable courses. Walker's own ships went on the offensive. HMS Starling, with Walker aboard, gained ASDIC contact on U-954 at 0340 hours. The hunt lasted 7 hours. Walker pioneered a technique he called creeping attack. One escort held ASDIC contact whilst another approached slowly, silently, to drop depth charges with devastating accuracy. U-954's hull imploded at 180 meters depth. All hands lost. By 8th of May, the Wolfpack had broken off, fuel and torpedoes exhausted, having sunk 3 ships from the non-Buttercup group and none from the zigzagging vessels. Walker's initial assessment, written in his after-action report, was characteristically understated. Pattern Buttercup appears to reduce successful torpedo attacks significantly. The evidence accumulated rapidly through May and June 1943. Walker's second support group escorted 7 convoys during this period, with Buttercup employed on 5 of them. The statistics were striking enough that the Admiralty's Operational Research Section, a relatively new organisation applying scientific methodology to naval warfare, took notice. They dispatched analysts to Liverpool to examine Walker's data alongside comparative figures from traditionally routed convoys. The numbers crystallised into an undeniable pattern. Convoys employing Buttercup Zigzag between May and August 1943 suffered an average loss rate of 2.1%, roughly 1 ship per 50. Comparable convoys on similar routes using straight line or simple evasive routing suffered 5.4% losses. The reduction wasn't quite 60%. Walker's initial estimate proved slightly optimistic, but it was 61% when comparing identical route segments during identical periods. The Operational Research Section's report, submitted in September 1943, concluded, Commander Walker's systematic zigzag pattern reduces successful torpedo attacks by approximately 3/5 compared to traditional convoy routing. More remarkable was the secondary effect Walker had predicted, but the Admiralty initially dismissed. Zigzagging convoys actually attracted more aggressive U-boat prosecution, which created killing opportunities for escorts. U-boat commanders, frustrated by repeated misses, stayed in contact longer, made more periscope observations, took riskier positions. This exposed them. Walker's second support group sank 6 U-boats between May and August 1943, an extraordinary rate when the entire Royal Navy averaged roughly 8 U-boat kills per month across all theatres. The turning point came with Convoy On 202 in October 1943. Walker escorted 41 merchant ships through weather so violent that 3 vessels suffered structural damage. U-boat group Schlieffen, 14 submarines, intercepted them south of Greenland. The ensuing 5-day battle saw Walker's group employing Buttercup continuously whilst simultaneously hunting attackers. The U-boats fired an estimated 57 torpedoes. 4 found targets. Walker's escorts sank 3 U-boats, U-282, U-842, and U-610. The kill-to-loss ratio, 3 U-boats destroyed for 4 merchants damaged, reversed the Atlantic's grim mathematics. Admiral Horton personally reviewed ON 202's results. On 3 November 1943, he issued an Admiralty fleet order mandating Buttercup's adoption across Western Approaches Command. The order was bureaucratically bland. Zigzag pattern. Buttercup is hereby authorized for convoy protection duties, but its implications were revolutionary. Decades of convoy doctrine overturned by one commander's obsessive calculations. Walker received promotion to captain and command of additional support groups, but the recognition he valued most came from an unexpected source. Decrypted German naval signals, which Walker never knew Britain could read, showed U-boat commanders reporting increasing frustration. One message from November 1943, sent by the commander of U-boat Group Tirpitz, complained, "Allied convoys now executing continuous evasive maneuvers, making deflection calculations impossible. Success rate has fallen dramatically. Request permission to withdraw from patrol area." Dönitz's response was terse. Maintain position, press attacks. But the mathematics had shifted against him. By December 1943, the broader Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. Multiple factors contributed: increased air cover, improved radar, more escorts, ultra-intelligence, acoustic torpedoes, but convoy zigzagging played a measurable role. The Operational Research Section's final report, published in January 1944, quantified Buttercup's contribution. It estimated the pattern had saved approximately 90 to 120 merchant ships between May and December 1943. That represented roughly 600,000 tons of shipping, carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and material that reached Britain rather than resting on the ocean floor. Walker himself remained at sea, driving himself and his crews relentlessly. By early 1944, his personal tally stood at 15 U-boats sunk or shared kills, making him the Royal Navy's most successful anti-submarine commander. He'd validated his obsessive calculations with results that spoke louder than Admiralty skepticism ever could. Walker never witnessed the full scope of his legacy. On 9th of July 1944, aged 48, he collapsed on the bridge of HMS Starling whilst returning to Liverpool. The ship's surgeon diagnosed complete physical exhaustion. Walker had driven himself without mercy, sleeping 4 hours nightly, constantly at sea, chain-smoking, subsisting on tea and nervous energy. He died that evening of a cerebral thrombosis, essentially a stroke brought on by chronic stress and overwork. The Royal Navy buried him with full honours at Liverpool's Rake Lane Cemetery. His final tally, 25 U-boats sunk or shared, more than any other Allied commander, but Buttercup outlived its creator. By mid-1944, virtually every Atlantic convoy employed systematic zigzag patterns, many based directly on Walker's calculations. The Admiralty's Tactical Division expanded the concept, developing patterns Buttercup, Daisy, and Primrose for different threat environments and convoy speeds. The patterns became standardized doctrine taught at HMS Excellent and incorporated into convoy commodore training. What Walker had conceived as an experimental solution became foundational naval tactics. The pattern's influence extended beyond immediate wartime application. Post-war analysis by the Admiralty's historical section concluded that systematic zigzagging, combined with increased escort numbers and air cover, reduced U-boat effectiveness by approximately 70% between May 1943 and war's end. Walker's geometric approach to the problem had proven that anti-submarine warfare could be scientifically optimized rather than left to intuition and courage alone. During the Cold War, Walker's principles influenced both NATO and Soviet naval doctrine, though in inverted form. Nuclear submarines, far faster and more capable than Type 7 U-boats, became the hunters. Surface vessels became potential prey. But the mathematics Walker had explored, the geometry of pursuit, the probability calculations of weapon employment, the advantages of unpredictable maneuvering, remained relevant. Soviet submarine commanders studied Walker's tactics to understand how Western surface groups might evade torpedo attacks. NATO anti-submarine forces studied them to understand optimal evasive patterns for carrier battle groups facing submarine threats. The Royal Navy's Submarine Command Course, established in 1917 but thoroughly revised post-war, incorporated Walker's engagement analyses into its curriculum. Submarine commanders learned to recognize systematic evasive patterns and adjust their approach accordingly. Surface warfare officers learned Walker's geometric principles for escort deployment and evasive maneuvering. The curriculum acknowledged that Walker had fundamentally altered the tactical calculation between submarine and surface vessel. Today, Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth includes Walker's case studies in its tactical training syllabus. Officer cadets study the mathematics of Buttercup not as historical curiosity, but as foundational understanding of how systematic analysis can solve apparently intractable tactical problems. The principle that rigorous mathematical thinking can overcome material disadvantage remains central to Royal Navy tactical philosophy. Modern naval weapons have evolved beyond recognition, but the geometric relationships between attacker, target, and weapon remain governed by the same physics Walker manipulated. Walker's personal papers, preserved at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, reveal a mind that saw warfare as applied mathematics. His notebooks contain calculations for problems far beyond convoy defense, optimal search patterns for hunting submarines, probability distributions for depth charge effectiveness, geometric solutions for escort positioning. Had he survived the war, one wonders what other insane solutions he might have calculated. The Atlantic remembers him differently than official histories suggest. His grave in Liverpool sees occasional visitors, elderly merchant seamen who crossed on his convoys, their children and grandchildren, naval officers paying respect. They come because Walker's obsessive calculations translated directly into survival. Every ship that reached port, because torpedoes missed by 800 yards, represented lives saved by geometry. In the brutal mathematics of the Atlantic, where Britain's survival hung by a thread measured in tons of shipping, one commander's systematic zigzag pattern cut losses by 3/5. Sometimes, the insane solution proves to be the only sane response.